World of Warfare presents Operation Bagration. Launched on June 22nd of 1944, the Soviet Union's offensive on the Eastern Front, codenamed Operation Bagration, so named after the Georgian prince and Russian general Pyotr Bagration, a hero of the Napoleonic Wars, proved to be one of the most decisive and devastating defeats for the Nazis during the entirety of World War II. In less than 2 months, the Soviet Red Army would shatter Germany's Army Group Center, the Nazis' largest and most prestigious military division on the Eastern Front, obliterating much of Germany's defensive positions in Belorussia, at the same time inflicting catastrophic casualties that accelerated a broader unraveling of the Third Reich in the single greatest defeat in German military history, even greater than Stalingrad. It also represented the culmination of Russia's strategic reform, operational maturity, and material superiority that spelled the end for Adolf Hitler's aspirations and overreach on the Eastern Front. By way of backstory, after the Soviets' victory during the summertime Battle of Kursk in 1943, the German army on the Eastern Front had lost its ability to conduct major strategic offensives, which stripped the Nazis of any form of operational reserves as it faced shortages in manpower, vehicles, artillery, and aircraft. At the same time, the Soviet strength had surged due to wartime industrial relocation, mass production of armor and artillery, and an overall maturation of its now highly experienced officer corps, which had at first been weakened by Joseph Stalin's Great Purge of the 1930s, which witnessed the execution or imprisonment of many competent Soviet officers. Given their newfound superiority, throughout late 1943 and early 1944, the Soviets conducted numerous offensives across the entirety of the 1,800-mile Eastern Front, including a series of right hooks during the Dnieper-Carpathian Offensive, which liberated much of Ukraine. In the north, the Soviets had broken the Germans' siege of Leningrad, pushing the Germans out of the city, yet the central section at Belorussia remained largely in German control due to heavy German fortifications in a geographic region rich with dense forests, marshlands, and limited transportation routes, natural barriers that led the Germans to believe that a Soviet summer offensive would occur in the Ukraine rather than Belorussia. The sector was also home to Germany's Army Group Center, long considered the Wehrmacht's strongest and most reliable formation of some 800,000 troops, backed by 9,500 guns, 900 tanks and self-propelled assault guns, and defensive fortifications built up over 3 years of Nazi occupation. From a geopolitical standpoint, Hitler viewed Army Group Center as something more than just a military formation, but rather a symbol of the overwhelming power of his Third Reich. Resisting a rising tide of pleas from his German high command to withdraw to more defensible terrain, Hitler insisted that Army Group Center held their ground at all cost, believing wrongly that any form of retreat would invite German collapse along the Eastern Front. As for the Allies, Stalin had promised FDR and Winston Churchill that he would launch Operation Bagration during or shortly after the Western Allies' scheduled D-Day landings on June 6, 1944, in an attempt to split German attention by relieving German resistance on the Normandy beachheads, which in turn validated the grand alliance between the big three leaders. To achieve their goals for a summer offensive on the Eastern Front, the Soviet High Command, or Stavka, originally envisioned 3 offensives, one in the north toward Finland, one in the south toward Romania and the Balkans, and a central offensive intended to liberate Belorussia, which later morphed into a series of offensives aimed at the central sector alone, with the primary goal of breaking through German defenses in Belorussia before destroying German units defending Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, and Brabrusk, followed by the liberation of Minsk by early July. Once Minsk was back in Soviet hands, the Red Army would then push west toward the Vistula River and the borders of East Prussia and Poland. The four-pronged offensive would include the First Baltic Front under the command of Ivan Bagration, the Third Belarusian Front under Ivan Chernyakhovsky, the Second Belarusian Front under Georgy Zakharov, and the First Belarusian Front under Konstantin Rokossovsky. On top of the Soviets' superiority of men and weaponry, including 1.7 million soldiers, 32,000 artillery pieces and mortars, 6,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and 5,300 aircraft, the Soviets' plan, also called Vermaskarava, or deception through radio silence, radio traffic regarding fake troop movements, and camouflage, intending to further persuade the Germans that Russia's summer offensive was aimed exclusively at the Ukraine or the Baltics. At dawn on the morning of June 22nd, the third anniversary of Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army unleashed what would prove to be one of the most intensive artillery bombardments of the war, while the Soviet Air Force, now enjoying near complete air supremacy over the Luftwaffe, strafed and bombed German airfields, command posts, supply dumps, frontline troop positions, and communication nodes, the latter intended to prevent the Germans from coordinating a cohesive response. In the north, the First Baltic Front and the Third Belarusian Front attacked the 3rd Panzer Army defending Vitebsk, and since Hitler strictly forbade any sort of withdrawal, the German garrison was encircled and eliminated by the evening of June 24th. To the south at Orsha, the Red Army attacked the Panther Line and the heavily fortified Orsha bottleneck, achieving successive breakthroughs against the Germans' strongest position across the entire Eastern Front, which in turn opened the highway to Minsk. That same day, Rokossovsky's First Belarusian Front launched a complex two-front assault on German defensive positions in and around Bobruisk, which proved decisive despite Stalin's initial resistance to the plan. By June 27th, Rokossovsky had encircled the German Ninth Army, trapping some 40,000 Wehrmacht soldiers, many attempting to break out through the marshlands surrounding the city before the majority of fleeing German troops were mowed down by Red Army soldiers. Many others drowned or were taken prisoner before Bobruisk fell on June 29th. Within 2 weeks since the start of the Soviets' offensive, two German armies, the 3rd Panzer and the 9th, had suffered catastrophic losses, and while the Soviets now pushed toward Minsk, the remnants of Army Group Center was now in full retreat across the Berezino River. With the German front collapsing, Stavka unleashed mobile exploitation forces consisting of tank corps, mechanized cavalry groups, and motorized rifle units, which surged westward through gaps in German defenses widened by Soviet infantrymen. Still bound by Hitler's no-retreat orders, the Wehrmacht found itself unable to respond dynamically, as their army command posts were quickly overrun, while retreat quarters and communication hubs were cut off. By July the 1st, Chernyakhovsky's Third Belarusian Front had closed in on Minsk from the northeast, while Bagration's First Baltic Front descended from the north in a pincer maneuver, along with Rokossovsky's column from Bobruisk, approaching from the southeast, effectively blocking the German Fourth Army's escape route. On July the 3rd, Soviet armored spearheads entered Minsk, and while fighting raged for a brief period, the Germans' lack of ammunition and mobility led to the city's liberation that same day. With more than 100,000 German troops encircled from the east and southeast at Minsk, a desperate escape attempt across the Berezino River led to what is now known as the Berezina Cauldron, when Soviet aircraft and artillery destroyed bridges and makeshift German crossing points, leading to the surrender and deaths of tens of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers by the end of July the 5th. After an appallingly short period of time since the start of hostilities, Army Group Center had ceased to exist as a cohesive fighting force. With Minsk back in Soviet hands, the Red Army continued their westward objective, taking Vilnius on July 13th after heavy fighting, Grodno and Bialystok 2 days later, and Lublin by July 24th. In the south, Soviet forces crossed the Bug River and advanced into eastern Poland, while in the north, the Red Army entered the heartland of Germany itself. The collapse and subsequent defeat led to Hitler's dismissal of Field Marshal Ernst Busch, replacing him with Field Marshal Walter Model, known as the Fireman for his ability to bring stability to crises on the battlefield. Model in turn formed a new defensive line. However, he could not undo the overwhelming losses to Army Group Center, now that entire German divisions had vanished from existence, while replacement units from the Western Front and the Balkans were inexperienced, understrength, and lacking heavy weapons. Nor could he replace over 350,000 seasoned troops who had been killed, wounded, missing, or captured, including nearly all command and logistical infrastructure, while most of his tanks and artillery had been destroyed or captured during the Soviets' devastating rout. By late July, Soviet spearheads had approached the Vistula River as they faced off with German defenses around Warsaw, leading to the Warsaw Uprising of August 1st of 1944, when the Polish Home Army attempted to liberate the city before Soviet forces could cross the Vistula River. Yet it was at the river that Operation Bagration ended for logistical reasons beyond German resistance, due primarily to troop exhaustion, supply shortages, and overstretched lines, leading to the uprising's tragic annihilation by German forces when the Soviets failed to come to their aid. The Soviets' victory over their invading enemy demonstrated the Red Army's operational mastery, achieved through multi-directional breakthroughs that shattered German cohesion, massive artillery concentrations at decisive moments in the battle, close coordination between infantry, army, engineers, and aviation, rapid exploitation of mobile forces once a breach had formed, and operational encirclements instead of linear advances, all contrasted by Germany's defensive rigidity dictated by Hitler's now erratic orders that prevented mobile defense movements or withdrawals. The Soviets' victory during Operation Bagration also relied heavily on deception, since Hitler and his German high command continued to believe until late in the offensive that the real Soviet attack was planned for the Ukraine or the Balkans, all supported by false Soviet radio traffic reporting on non-existent formations, the use of dummy tank armies positioned far from the real attack zones, and the lack of Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights due to Soviet air supremacy. Other reasons for Germany's defeat under Operation Bagration include the fact that Belorussia had one of the most active and effective partisan movements on the European continent. As Bagration began, Belarusian partisans began blowing up rail lines and bridges, attacking German rearguard units while severing German communication lines, which severely hindered German troop movements while slowing the eventual arrival of reinforcements. By the time Operation Bagration had ended, 28 of 34 divisions of Army Corps Center had been destroyed, with German casualties estimated at 350,000 to 450,000 men, compared to 250,000 German casualties at Stalingrad, all at a loss of hundreds of tanks, guns, and vehicles. The Soviets, in turn, suffered 180,000 to 230,000 killed or missing in action, and approximately 550,000 wounded or sick, at a loss of hundreds of tanks, aircraft, and artillery pieces. As for German troop suffering, survivors of Army Corps Center later described encirclements filled with corpses, forests littered with wrecked equipment, endless retreat under punishing air attacks, partisan ambushes and roadblocks, and units reduced from divisions to companies overnight. As for German prisoners in Soviet captivity, survival rates were mercilessly low due to brutal treatment that killed many before the end of World War II. Bagration also dealt a severe psychological blow to German morale, ending the myth of German invincibility, while German commanders lost confidence in Hitler's strategic judgment. Even Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels privately admitted Bagration was catastrophic. The Soviets' victory during Operation Bagration also opened up the road to Berlin, positioning the Red Army for its final campaigns of the war. including its assault on East Prussia in late 1944, the Vistula-Oder offensive of January 1945, and the Battle of Berlin in April and May of 1945. Though sometimes overshadowed in Western narrative by Normandy and the Western Front, Operation Bagration stands as one of the most decisive military campaigns in history, a sweeping, brilliantly executed operation that shattered Hitler's Eastern Empire and set the stage for the final destruction of the Third Reich. Even before Hitler's mental instability and drug use began to rage in the final months before his suicide, attempts by German resistance groups to assassinate Hitler before the outbreak of World War II led the Führer to become increasingly paranoid over the recurring threats to his life, adding layers of armed guards for his protection while frequently making last-minute changes to his schedule. As it became increasingly apparent that Army Corps Center was being crushed by the Soviets' Bagration offensive, a group of high-ranking German military leaders opted for yet another assassination attempt before staging a coup d'etat against remaining Nazi leaders. Led by Generals Ludwig Beck, Friedrich Albrecht, Henning von Tresckow, and Lieutenant Colonel Klaus Stauffenberg, during a planned meeting at Hitler's Wolf Lair bunker on July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg planted a briefcase packed with high explosives under a conference table to be used for the upcoming high-level meeting with the Führer, departing the room on a trumped-up story about taking an important phone call. Unbeknownst to Stauffenberg, another officer moved the briefcase away from Hitler's seat before the bomb detonated at 12:42 that afternoon. 4 people were mortally wounded, while Hitler suffered only minor injuries, remaining well enough to keep an appointment with Benito Mussolini before giving the Italian dictator a tour of the bomb site. In the aftermath of the attempted assassination, Stauffenberg and Albrecht were arrested and executed the following day, while some 200 others were eventually tried and executed for treason against the Nazi regime. Erwin Rommel was also linked to the plot, but was given the chance of standing trial or committing suicide in an effort to spare his family. Opting for the latter, the Nazis covered up the true cause of death for the renowned field marshal before honoring him with a state funeral, making Operation Bagration and the July 20 plot one of the final blows against Nazi aggression.